What makes the boat is the captain and the crew and the way that they respond to each other. Once I send the boat out, I send it out with everything that I can give it. I'll put every imaginable aspect that I can think of that will make the boat safe and strong and seaworthy and last a long time. But the captain then takes it over, and he takes it to sea, and he has to know the limitations of the boat. He has to understand the weather and the conditions that he's in. And it's the same as the Titanic. When the Captain Smith was under a lot of pressure to make a schedule, to have a deadline, but he was the captain, and he was responsible for running that vessel at high speed in areas where they knew there were ice. And if the mate on watch didn't see the iceberg and they slammed into it, the ultimate responsibility doesn't fall on the builder, it falls on the master.
I would say the most decisive factor in that whole tragedy was the overconfidence in the technology of the time. And it was cutting-edge, very sound technology. So it was a very well-built ship. It was, engineering-wise, it was very sound, but it was pushed beyond nature's limits.
The Titanic tragedy can be explained in many ways. It can be explained in terms of science and technology. It can be explained in terms of human error and several serious flaws in human nature. But I think it can also be explained in terms of luck. From all the evidence, it seems the Titanic was destined to be an unlucky ship. Few people on Earth are more superstitious than those who sail the seas. A sailor will never willingly sail on a ship he considers to be an unlucky ship. 22 of the Titanic's crew failed to show up for duty the morning she sailed. It's quite probable they sensed what we now know for sure.
I must admit, as a sailor, I am very superstitious myself. I don't have any particular rituals that I go through, but I get feelings and will make decisions based on what the boat tells me sometimes. It's funny how a boat will just tell you things, and sometimes you just get a feeling, and if you go with it, then you'll be much better off.
Builders like Burnham are careful to observe certain traditions, like placing a coin beneath the mast.
That's a lucky thing. It seems like if you put a penny in, a new penny, the year you built the boat, if nothing else, you'd have a record of how old the boat is. I know that Jeff Thomas put a $5 gold piece under each of the Puritans' masts, and she went to the bottom within 90 days. So that might or might not be a lucky thing to do. I don't know.
Superstition even touches the more sophisticated activities of midshipmen at the U.S. Naval Academy.
Oh, there's all kinds. There's for instance, upstairs in this hall, you'll see a statue of just the head and shoulders of Admiral Hyman Rickover, who was the father of the nuclear navy and a tremendous engineer, made our Navy possible to where it is today. But you'll see midshipmen before big exams go and rubbing his nose for good luck. And so if you go by the statue, you'll see his nose is all bright and silver, especially during test times compared to the rest of the statue.
Many superstitions center on the building, naming, and launching of a vessel. It has long been considered bad luck to give a ship an impressive name. Names should be humble in order not to offend the gods of the wind and the sea. Titanic is certainly not a humble name. To change the name of a ship has also been considered bad luck. A case in point is the infamous Great Eastern, a ship plagued by terrible luck throughout its career. Several men were killed when she was launched in 1858. A worker was also crushed when the Titanic was launched. The death of workers during a launch has always been a harbinger of ill fortune. The Great Eastern nearly sank on her sea trials and was involved in collisions and other ruinous difficulties. Many believe it was because her original name was changed to the Great Eastern. What was she originally named? The Titanic. The practice of christening a ship has always been a way of protecting a vessel against bad luck at sea.
Yeah, the idea of christening a ship started around the Dark Ages, I believe not long after the Black Plague. And originally it was rather a gruesome affair. For good luck, they used to sling an unbaptized baby against the prow of the ship. They cleaned it up a little bit as the years went on, went over to bottles of champagne, and at Holland and Wolff they had decided not to christen ships at all. They basically just built them and shoved them out into the water without any christening. And some people like to claim, oh, that's why the Titanic went down, that it was bad luck, and that's why the Titanic and the Britannic ran into bad luck.
According to legend, many people around the world had premonitions of the Titanic disaster. Some of the Belfast workers were reported to have had frightening premonitions. Individuals with second sight or the ability to predict the fortune of voyagers sailing to sea is an old tradition in Ireland where the ship was built. Several of Titanic's passengers reported having dreams or visions of the ship sinking before it reached America. Several psychics are said to have predicted the tragedy. Yet, most of these stories don't bear up under investigation or are simply coincidence or are based on hindsight. But there is one perception of the tragedy that is very difficult to explain away.
It was in a novel written some 14 years before the Titanic went down.
That was a fellow named Morgan Robertson, and he was writing these novels. At the time they called them the penny dreadfuls, and they really were. They were corny, they were horrible to read, and he actually wrote some horrible things about people. Yet he did manage to somehow hit almost right on the dot with things such as the Titanic. He described the ship almost exactly the dimensions of the Titanic, that set sail on an April night and struck an iceberg and went down, and a lot of people's lives lost because it had too few lifeboats. Very much the story of the Titanic. And even beyond that, as you go through his other books, his other stories, you find some pretty shocking things. You find out in another one of the stories that the Titanic had a sister ship called the Gigantic. And this ship is described being stricken by a torpedo or a mine, and the ship's stern rises in the air during daylight and goes down even faster than its sister ship, the Titan, went down. Interestingly, the Titanic had an almost identical twin sister ship called the Britannic that was built after the Titanic was built. And this ship was, after the Titanic sank, they changed the name of the ship. The sister ship was originally going to be named the Gigantic.
The disaster Robertson foretold not only involved a ship of almost identical dimensions as the Titanic, but it was a luxury liner that set out from England to New York with 2,000 passengers, many of them wealthy celebrities. Like the Titanic, the Titan was on her maiden voyage, and like the Titanic, she had been called unsinkable by her builders.
By all accounts, both the fictional account of Morgan Robertson and the real accounts of those who have researched the tragedy, the Titanic was from the beginning what most sailors would call an unlucky ship. But the worst luck of all is represented by another voyage which began far to the north, off the coast of Greenland.
It had been a warm winter on the Isle of Greenland. On the island's western coast and through its deep fjords, the great inland ice cap moved toward the sea at speeds of 10 to 100 feet per day. When these enormous masses of frozen fresh water, averaging 5,000 feet thick, reached the cliffs along the coast, they broke off from the glacier. Because of the warmer weather that winter of 1911 and 1912, more of these icebergs were calved from the parent mass than was usual. And in the spring of 1912, one of these huge islands of ice, sometimes called the Rocks of Despair by mariners, began its 5,000-mile voyage toward its rendezvous in the North Atlantic. The International Ice Patrol is an organization that tracks icebergs moving into the shipping lanes between Europe and America. It monitors the position of ice and warns ships of its presence. The Ice Patrol was established in 1913 as a direct response to the Titanic tragedy. Dr. Donald L. Murphy is Chief Oceanographer with the Ice Patrol.
We generally consider that the glaciers of Greenland generate many thousands of icebergs each year. It's really hard to count them because, in fact, one gigantic iceberg, something that might be on the order of a kilometer in diameter can generate many, many small icebergs as it breaks apart and moves down towards the shipping lanes. They range from what we call growlers, which are something on the order of 10 or so meters in length, and they might be a few, maybe 10,000 or so pounds, I'm sorry, 10,000 or so tons of ice. That's the smallest range that we deal with, and they can extend up to very large. Now, in the western North Atlantic, a 1-million-ton iceberg is a large iceberg, is considered to be a large iceberg, and a 5 or 10 million ton iceberg is newsworthy. Well, we don't know what size the iceberg was that the Titanic struck. I can only judge the size of that iceberg by the sort of damage that was inflicted on the Titanic. It seems to have been a dramatic collision, and so you can expect that it was maybe on the order of 60 to 100 meters long or something of that nature. It perhaps could have been several 100,000 tons of ice. We've tracked icebergs using satellite technology. We've actually placed ice beacons on icebergs near the glacial fronts and tracked those tracked icebergs for several years. They calve from, let's say the iceberg calved from the center of the west coast of Greenland. Its first motion would actually be northward along the coast of Greenland, and then it only turns to the west in the northern part of Baffin Bay, at which time it starts to take a southerly track down the coast of Baffin Island and down the coast of Labrador, and finally off by Newfoundland and into the shipping lanes. The iceberg that struck the Titanic most likely had been moving in the ocean for about 2 or 3 years.
Of the thousands of icebergs calved on Greenland's coast, it is estimated that only about 1/4 to 1/2 of 1% ever make it all the way to the shipping lanes. For a ship to hit an iceberg is not a very likely event.
What the